Well, at that time, there was only two of us in the country. My mentor, a guy by the name of Chuck Leonard, who went home to be with the Lord just 2 years ago. Chuck was very kind. I met him while I was still in the military, but he was a civilian, and he took a liking to me. And I used to write him letters and send him tapes, and he was very kind. And he kept saying to me, man, if you keep doing what you're doing, he said, don't get trapped in the whole thing with people, and go back with me real quickly to the 70s. That don't get trapped in a mindset of black people telling you that you have to only work at a so-called black radio station that's formatted at African Americans. He said, you need to work where somebody will pay you well for your talents, because God has given you a gift. And so when R&B radio stations would not hire me, top 40 stations did, as you know. And so I continued to work at it, and my name started getting around, and that's how Bill Drake and these people found me. And the guy that I had worked for at 99X, a guy named Mel Phillips. Mel Phillips went to work as vice president of programming for NBC. And so when they weren't pleased with what was happening there, and they needed an afternoon person, because they had Imus in the morning, you know the name Imus?
Of course, who doesn't?
Imus in the morning and Walt Baby Love in the afternoon. That was their promotion in New York City for television, also for subway posters and buses, as well as newspaper advertising.
Wow, that was a nice little 1-2 punch. I'm in the morning, you in the afternoon, and you being at a top 40 station and being like one of the most popular DJs kind of reminds me of a similar situation back in the 80s over at 107.5 WGCI in Chicago, when Bob Wall, who is white, was one of the most popular radio personalities on a CHR urban or Churban radio station in the mid-'80s, and couldn't nobody touch him in the radio zone in Chicago.
You recall, Bob Wall and all those guys came after me because I became vice president of programming at WGCI and WVON, Voice of the Negro, in Chicago in 1975, and then again in 1978. And in 78 is when I started WGCI and hired their first live staff, and Bob Wall was one of the people who came later. But prior to him was a guy by the name of J.D. Holliday, whose real name was Paul Zarcone. And I hired Paul to be the program director under me of WGCI, and many people in the African-American community in Chicago were upset that I would hire a white guy to run the radio station. But J.D. and I had worked together at WBLS in New York City, where he was extremely popular, and he became popular in Chicago. And I was proven correctly, because in a matter of 3 rating books, WGCI was in the top 5 radio stations in Chicago, where they had never had a black FM station succeed like that before.
Definitely a big movement. Over at BLS, I believe Frankie Crocker, Chief Rocker, was over there running things, correct?
Frankie Crocker hired me to work in his place when he continued to run WBLS from here in Los Angeles. But he was living here, but he was running BLS in New York. And I would work his air shift from 4 p.m. until 8 p.m. Mondays through Saturday.
And also at WVON in Chicago, that was the radio station where Don Cornelius got his start pre-Soul Train. I believe so.
Don Cornelius you're talking about?
Yeah, I think this was back in the 60s.
That's absolutely correct. He was there prior to myself, because he was a police officer in Chicago and was interested in radio, and somebody gave him a part-time job there, and he started working there while he was also still a police officer, and then later got his Soul Train thing going locally for television in the city of Chicago with Tribune Communications.
Now, radio back then, listening to it, it seemed like it was very tedious, because you guys didn't have the technological luxuries like we have now with computers and everything. Because I still can see in our radio station we have reel-to-reels, and tell me what that process was like, doing reel-to-reels and loading up cart machines and having chances that the cart can misfire on you while you're on air.
It was quite interesting for me. You know, for example, if somebody was interviewing like you or me now, we had to keep, say, our records playing that were on vinyl, on turntables going, and you had 2 of them going usually at one time, besides the things in the cart machines, meaning the commercials and stuff like that. Then maybe you would have your reel-to-reel where you were recording, say, this telephone conversation, so that you could play it back, and you had to do it all yourself. So, needless to say, you had to be on top of your game. You had to be very fast. You had to be able to do 3 or 4 things at the same time, while also trying to entertain the people from the standpoint of being creative in your thought process, while also following the format that your bosses would have laid out for you for the radio station. So for me, it was kind of interesting I liked it because it was exciting, because you had so much to do. You never had a chance to relax, and you obviously could not be lazy. And the fact that you had to get good ratings, meaning if you could keep people listening, hopefully that would translate into ratings and translate into revenue for the radio station, and you got to keep your job.
Right, definitely.
And if not, you got fired.
And that still goes on today, because I remember back in the 80s, especially in New York, when WABC left top 40, it wasn't until 1983, I believe, when Z100 came on the air that top 40 was in New York. And because Z100 was so big in the ratings, basically Hot 97 and WPLJ combated their playlist by adding more dance, rhythmic, freestyle, heavy music, and it made for a good CHR ratings war out in New York in the 80s.
That's very true. Something I want to say here just real quick, Jarrell, is I'm extremely impressed with the fact that you know the history of radio, sort of not just regionally, but nationally in this country. And I truly believe that young men and women that are interested in broadcasting, whether it's radio or television, should know the history. If you know the history, you can figure out how to get to where it is you'd like to go, whatever your interest in broadcasting is. For example, everybody doesn't want to be a talent. Some people want to be in sales, and more people in sales make seven-figure salaries than people that are talent. And a lot of people don't realize that, but I do think young people that are majoring in communications, because I noticed during the recent Final Four for basketball in the NCAA that you had all of these guys that were playing basketball, specifically African Americans, would say their major, and their major was communications. And I'm thinking to myself, what do these guys plan to do? Because when they interview them, most of them couldn't speak very well. Couldn't articulate, as my grandmother used to say, the King's English. She was an English teacher. Mm-hmm. So my grandmother was extremely tough on me, as well as my cousins, about our speech and being able to read well. And I'm thinking to myself, now what are these people majoring in? If they're majoring in communications, what is it that they really want to do? That was confusing to me. But I'm recommending that young people like yourself, the fact that you know this history, I'm very impressed, because I think it'll take you a long way depending on what it is you choose to do, whether it's continue to be a talent or get into management, get into ownership, get into sales, get into marketing, what the different forms of things within the communications business itself.
Right. I appreciate the compliment. And it seemed like back then, before the Telecommunications Act of 96, there were a lot more competition in the terms of radio. Like I said, with Hot 97, Z100, PLJ. Then in Chicago, you had BBM and another radio station, which I can't recall. So it was like one station was trying to outdo the other. Then when that act came in 96, it was like conglomerates such as Clear Channel, Infinity, and other big names started swallowing up the competition and consolidating, and there you get no diversity in set formats.